The thing that I was going to be talking about today is basically, why and how it's important to make great building projects. And I say that because it takes work, and it really is a decision to focus on making great projects. It's not as easy as just sort of letting it happen, and kind of working through it. It really does take a decision at the very highest level at the beginning of a project to hold on to that as you go through the process of making so many decisions over so many months or years. So, fundamentally, a lot of it has to do with the question of, is great really worth it to you? And I'll talk about sort of what I mean by that in a minute here. But, without talking about specific, facilities, like this is just a picture of a climbing gym. And, to me, this is a facility that, when I look at it, I see that it sort of checks a box. It's sort of a lot of kind of stripy climbing walls, and everything's kind of white. And, it just, for me, this is a climbing gym. I don't have much else to say about it. And you're really competing against any other way to spend time and money. And more these days, that also includes just staying home and doing nothing. And, motivating kids to actually get up and do stuff. It turns out that the way that we can do that is still just with sort of remarkable physical spaces and experiences. Like, that stuff has just never gotten old. It has never really gone away. And I think more and more, as we're seeing the research on that, this type of a third space or these type of experiences, maybe even if it's a sort of one-off thing, like a trampoline park or something, these spaces and these experiences are still things that people want to be doing. And they're showing up in numbers for it, especially after being, sort of locked inside for years, really. And we're seeing that across the sort of real estate development world in general. And as we are also working within that context, this type of experiential real estate, this type of project, things like climbing gyms specifically, are becoming more mature. And that means that there's more competition. So, the idea that competition is a bad thing for you is just not actually really what the numbers show at all. If you have an identity, and if you really focus on doing the vision and the version of that vision that you want really well, you will probably make more money when there's competition. And I could cite very specific examples within the climbing industry of this happening over and over. And even the White House is talking about the importance of competition in our economy. They talk about it partly from the sort of consumer point of view, but also pointing out that it makes you better as a business because you have to have better standards. You have to actually deliver on what you're saying you're doing. And if you do that, you inherently are going to be building more loyalty and more people who are going to want to actually stay with you because they're getting good service. And one example of, a very saturated climbing market, and it's called the Boulder bubble, Boulder, Colorado, for a reason. But even still, when I was living there in the early 2000s, there was really one climbing gym, the Boulder Rock Club. And, Cats was the sort of bouldering wall within a gymnastics facility. And so it was almost more like a Woody. And people went to both. Some people went to one or the other. When the spot opened in the early 2000s, people thought it was nuts. People thought there's no way a bouldering only facility, number one, would ever make it. And they even had top ropes. So it wasn't even that they went like whole hog bouldering only, but people thought that would never happen. You can't have two climbing gyms in one area. You can't have a bouldering only facility in one area. Both of those things today, 20 years later, 23, 24 years later, seem ridiculous. But they also were very different from each other. And I was designing climbing walls at the time. So I actually was able to climb at the Rock Club for free because the company I worked with had built it. And I paid for a membership at the spot because it was different, because it had an identity, because the actual climbing was very fun. The boulders that Monolithic had made were very fun to climb on. And now you look at Boulder and there's another massive gym. And there's all these sort of smaller gyms like ABC for kids, the ice co-op, different things like that. And so it just sort of continues to show that the awareness in a market grows with competition. So as you grow the market, your sort of pool that you're pulling from gets bigger. And that's partly because you have competition who's helping you pull that, sort of put the word out. So when they come to you, what do they find? Are they finding something that has some uniqueness? A big aspect of this is that this is good business. This makes you more resilient. It makes you more unique, even in a field where it might not seem that it's that different. There are a lot of ways that you can sort of extract your own identity. And it does, whether it's publicity or whatever, it helps you sort of widen the audience of people who are looking at what you do. And I think most importantly, creating results that, people can walk into, whether they're climbers or not, and just be compelled by, creating spaces that people want to spend time in. Parents, when they drop their kids off, people who will, do some work in a co-working space or lounge, coming back for an event, people renting out these spaces for events that have nothing to do with climbing. Creating climbing that you actually want to climb on, not just some swirly climbing wall that sort of is completely, for me, I don't know what it is. I'm not sort of compelled. When we were designing these climbing walls, we had a very clear, I'll talk about this with intent in just a minute, but there was a real idea of like what we were doing with these. The vision of these things is these sort of icebergs and the sort of large flat geometries with corners and sort of creating a very setter friendly environment with the shaping of the boulders, but also creating visually, I think, very striking boulders. And just some other examples and some current examples of, projects that are pushing to do something, I think, different. This is a publicly talked about project in Florida where it's this sort of existing site. We're doing an addition and climbing and skateboarding plaza that's really an event space and potentially a standing wave and potentially housing component as well. And these sort of economies that are created in these developments and other facilities. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about, and this is just a project that I think exemplifies that, is that it doesn't necessarily mean you're spending a lot of money to make spaces that really have a big impact. And this is an example of that. The guys at Summit City, did a lot of this themselves. When we designed the walls, it was intentionally geared for them to be building it themselves with their contractor. So my point is that the decision to make great projects should be something that sort of ripples through everything from the highest level. And that's why today we're going to be talking about principles, because the principles of this sort of filter down through everything. And I'll tell you exactly what that means in just a minute. But the sort of term good to great, I think Jim Collins can probably lay claim to that. Jim Collins actually is a climber. He was living in Boulder when I was living in Boulder. I didn't know him, but I would be climbing in the gym with him. I had far less interest in business back then when I was, 20 years old. But, the way that they talk about good to great is a lot of discipline. So disciplined people, disciplined thought, disciplined action. I interpret that as there's a lot of control. There's a lot of intentional decision making, which is, again, why I use the word intent. The idea for them, this is directly from them, this inflection point, the arrow as it goes up, this sort of cycle over and over, building momentum, having an idea, testing the idea, seeing the result, learning from it, and just doing it again. And the flywheel gaining momentum. And the design process is very similar. Good is the enemy of great. I think that this is why it's a decision, because if you're okay with things being good enough, it gets in the way of creating something great. And at the end of the day, I'm a realist. I build things like real things. And the reality is that not everything is as important as other things. So there is hierarchy of decision-making, hierarchy of where we spend our money, but we have to be if we're intentional with that, things we're not spending money on so that we can spend money on other things we care about. that's a way to be a realist and still keep that ambition of sort of good to great. And a couple examples of this, you know, in race car driving, Formula One, you know, the difference between being like a world champion and being like the laughing stock of the sport is often fractions of a second. And very often they're accumulating hundredths, tenths of a second. You know, 0.2 of a second is like, oh my gosh, what's wrong with that person? They're so far behind. I mean, that's, you know, in our world, that's almost nothing. My point is that at the truly highest level, being great is often about accumulating a lot of tenths or a lot of little bits in different areas, which is why I say we have to have that decision at the highest level, because everything is an opportunity to maintain that focus on how we can do this the best we can. And this is just my comparison that, you know, to me, there's just so many different aspects of this I could point to, whether it's, you know, just the way the color is used, the way, and when I look at the image on the right of one of my projects, you know, the intent with how the climbing walls are placed, how the layout is done, how the furniture has been done, the color on the walls, the color on the ceiling, all these different decisions that I think lead to a result that is in almost any image going to be markedly different than sort of just checking the box with a climbing gym. And my whole point with all of this is that in a market that is maturing, it's not good enough to be good, because when somebody comes in who's got an opinion and got a vision, and you're sort of like middling and with an dispassionate membership group, are they going to stay with you when something shows up that is very cool? And I think my answer is it's, you know, might be doubtful. And so this sort of the rings of the tree, if you will, we're going to be talking about the principles, because to me, that's the thing that envelops everything. The process is sort of how we implement those principles. The phases, meaning like different sort of chunks, meaning like dreaming, developing, you know, documenting, and then the steps, which are much more specific, and the tactics, which are further specific yet, you know, management. We're not going through all of this today. We're focusing on principles. I'm going to be building out more sort of webinars on these different layers, because I think each of them it's the way it really works. I'm not just making this up for a lecture or a webinar. This is how it really works, which is why I'm trying to translate it on these types of situations. And another way to look at this is that the principles are sort of the blue sky that filter down to the tactics. And so the principles being the sort of highest blue sky, the process being, you know, how do we still blue sky? How do we imagine trying to implement these different principles? The phases, now we're getting really real, like we're getting into it. The steps, you know, we're digging ditches now. And the tactics are like, what are the tools we're using to dig those ditches? So it's sort of, to me, this diagram really is sort of bringing you down to earth from the blue sky to the tactics. And it looks like, to me, it sort of looks like this, where the process, I'll get to the principles in a moment here. The process is really about creating an argument. There's not a right or wrong way to do this. So what is it that you want to do, and how do we create an argument to bring up people along with us? Oops. The phases are a lot more generalized, you know, this sort of dreaming and developing and like initial investments versus documenting a project versus building a project. You know, these are sort of bigger buckets that are getting more specific. The steps with milestones, these diamonds are milestones. And again, I'll talk about this in another situation. There's more information on this on my website. But these milestones of signing an LOI, signing a lease, you know, what's happening at each of these stages, what's happening between these stages, you know, what should we be focusing on at these different stages? And then the tactics, which a lot of the YouTube videos are focusing on, you know, keeping your options open, you know, are you focusing on the right thing, you know, avoiding the shiny object syndrome. These are very specific sort of moments, which by the way are almost entirely based on direct experience, either from myself or with clients. Usually what happens is I'll be dealing with something with a client or a series of clients, and I'll make a video talking about it, sort of not specifically. The principles, why do I focus on principles? Because these projects take forever. They take months to years, many months to years at the shortest. And so having principles that we can anchor to is critical, because otherwise we might lose our way. And the process of how we go through it, again, creating architecture and argument. This has been something I've been focused on for, almost 20 years now with my, going back to my graduate work. The phases, these sort of bigger buckets, and then the real steps, finding a space, LOI, visualization, documenting, construction, pre-construction. When do you hire people? These are like real tangible steps that have investment metrics attached to them. And then the tactics, very specific topics. And so the principles that I'm going to go over today are really things we have to choose. Like number one, we have to choose to make great things. The ones I haven't touched on yet that I'm going to go through, we have to know it's not just about spending more. It's not about having bigger budgets. It's about using our budget in the best way we can to make great things. And furthermore, we don't need to invent new things. It often isn't about inventing things. It's about understanding how to put things together. And that's why, number 4, focusing on ingredients and intent is so key. And focusing on the relationship between things, because you can have the best things, the best ingredients and intent, but if they're not put together the right way, it doesn't really matter and won't have much effect. And then finally, seeing obstacles as opportunities, because we just have to look at it that way. That has to be one of our foundational principles. And so we've got the do's and the don'ts, and I'm going to go through some don'ts because there's also principles of things that we just fundamentally have to avoid. So this will be fairly quick as we go through these. All right, choosing to make great things. The follow-up to Good to Great was a book called Great by Choice. And their quote that I like is, we're not imprisoned by circumstances. We are free to choose, free to become great by choice. And I totally believe that's true. We have the freedom within the budget that you already have to choose to effort to be great, not just good. Examples of this in sort of real world, you can buy surfboard fins for $10, for $25, or you can buy them for $175, $135, 10 times more expensive. A lot of times it's asking ourselves the question, what is it, without adding any money to anything? A lot of it starts with you. Are there things in your life you can start, things you can stop, things you need to adjust, modify, or improve? Stacking Decisions, both of these books I would highly recommend. They're mindset books. It's choosing as individuals to also try to be better versions of ourselves, because the self-development that you will see will impact the business directly. You can imagine the opposite side of that coin. If you're a disaster, getting wasted every night, not getting enough sleep, are you going to be able to build something great? Probably not. So the inverse is also, I have found to be totally true, where if you're sort of treating life almost like an athletic event, like keeping yourself in good shape, your mind in the right place, I just think, and a lot of other people would say, you're setting yourself up to have a more likelihood of being able to create something that's truly great. Principle 2, we have to know it's not about just spending more. There's architecture examples of this all around the world of people building things with basically no budgets that are really pretty great and certainly have huge impacts on the people that are getting to use them. This is a group called Rural Studio. It's a lot of sort of community-based buildings and very low-cost housing that have the highest impact on these people's lives with extremely simple materials, simple shapes, but done by people with real skill, real good architects, real good builders, by people who care about them and care about living in them. And the results are, over decades have been great. And a quick restaurant analogy, a group like Noma, like one of the best restaurants in the world, they spend a lot of money on their building. They spend a lot of money on their kitchen. They spend a lot of money making food that is very creative, let's say. So the alignment of their investment in their building, their investment in the operation, their investment in the architecture, it's all very high. You also, though, don't necessarily need to invest at the same level of all of those things to create things that are really great. This is a food truck I used to go to when I was living in Boston, and their stuff was great. It was, and it had no location really. They have locations now, but that wasn't how they started. Really good ingredients, not expensive. Location almost didn't matter. And an example that I think is actually more relevant to what we do, when I was building gyms in Chicago, I used to go to this place, Au Cheval, which is hard to even go to now because it's so popular. But it's this little bar, this little restaurant with beautiful sort of leather chairs. And, it's all done really well. It's not crazy expensive, but they also put together the way that they do the line. It's very specific. Everything gets cooked on a griddle that's on the right. There's almost no space to cook, but yet they're known for making this amazing food. If this is what you're into, and I am, and it's amazing. And so it has everything to do with their intent and where the investment goes, so that they can really focus on making the thing that's great in their mind. It's not Noma, but to them, that's probably a good thing. So again, these examples of architecture that are just pretty remarkable because they cared, because they insisted on doing something great. And a project like this, it comes down to, really intent, but then very quickly assembly and technique. Materials are very cheap. The techniques used to them are sort of tricky. They're kind of like novel in the way they get put together. All right. We don't need to invent new things. The answers are already out there for all of us. The idea of creating something completely new is a very high bar. So when I was teaching design studios, I would really just try to help people just understand that everything is based in precedent in the world of architecture and design. New things are generally iterations of other things, even if it doesn't seem like it. One of the movies that I love is Knives Out, and Daniel Craig's character talks about gravity's rainbow, the idea that the answers are already out there. The process is to ask questions and listen for answers. That has nothing to do with how I was taught to design in architecture school. I have found over the years, though, in practice, that every client has a unique fingerprint for their project if you ask them questions to extract it from them and then help them develop it. So I use things like improvisation as analogies. It's a back and forth, but it fundamentally comes down to asking questions. And an example of how an idea might get repurposed or sort of evolve. So you may have an idea from one place and it sort of shows up somewhere else. So this was a project from Rem Koolhaas, who is a very famous architect. Super rough sketch, sort of voids within floor plates. Turns into a very specific building proposal, competition building proposal, and, very abstract drawings. This was in, I think, the 90s. And then about a decade, 2 decades later, the Seattle Public Library starts being developed. And it's very similar in terms of these voids, this sort of solid and open areas. And the Seattle Library is a very different looking thing, but very almost exactly the same narrative description of ideas, just being executed totally differently and sort of put into a different site and shifted around. So many times it's not about inventing anything. It's really about listening and asking questions and not pretending like we know everything. It's really a team sport. And, this was a YouTube video I made that was, the Tao is a design manual. And the whole point of this was the Tao talks a lot about just sort of listening and taking a step back. And so that's why I was calling it a design manual, which I still deeply believe in, by the way. And that's not trying to belittle it because it's obviously a guide to life, but it also, I think, applies to design specifically. One of the things also about that is that from a mindset point of view, the number of things that have been invented when people were on, say, psychedelics, I'm not advocating for this. I'm advocating for a mindful approach to problem solving. Francis Crick, Nobel Prize winning geneticist, was on LSD when he first deduced the double helix structure of DNA. Nikola Tesla talked about being a receiver of ideas. Tesla invented things like the AC motor. He was trying to invent free power. He was trying to invent these world-changing things. And he described himself as not an inventor, but a receiver. So just listening. And he didn't talk about the drug aspect, and neither did Einstein. Einstein talks about imagination and its preview of life's coming attractions. And when in psychology today, they talk about this, where they talk about his form of meditation was like an analytic meditation, following an idea deeply. And they talk about relativity. Einstein talks about coming up with the theory of relativity. These are fundamental understandings for our world, DNA, relativity. This isn't somebody sitting and staring at a computer or a notebook. It is somebody thinking, asking themselves questions, asking other questions, and just playing it out in their mind. And whether it's with meditation or breathing or just having a little quiet time in your head, whatever you want to call it, I have found that is 100% when so many answers flow to you. And the Dalai Lama talks about it the same. This idea, he actually talks about analytic meditation, the way Einstein looks at it, as a very specific type of meditation that is really trying to help complement our more sort of less mindful mind, but our more analytical mind, like when we are staring at a computer, combining it with this more sort of purpose-driven meditation, which is different than other kinds of meditation. But for me, it's just sort of the point is quieting our mind so that we can actually listen. I have found that I find as I get older, as I do that more, my creativity and my listening ability has gone way up than when I was trying to just come up with the next new thing, which is very stressful. This is not, honestly. And Einstein talks about it. I never teach my pupils. I attempt to provide the conditions in which they can learn. So when I work with clients, this isn't about me. I'm just explaining my method, which is trying to get them to talk about their project, asking them questions, goals, and mindset to try to trigger some thinking that maybe they haven't really spent much time thinking about and probably haven't at least put on paper. So that way of just getting people to think can extract that fingerprint and lead to answers that are right there when we look at them in a more mindful way. And so what are those things? That's why we have to focus on intent and ingredients, because it becomes more clear to me in that process. What are the things we actually do have to focus on? And then what are we actually trying to do with them? So, one example of this would be something like sushi, where, the ingredients, hopefully it's good salmon, hopefully it's good, all these things are good and not rotten, but it's pretty darn basic. It's not like any of this has been messed with too much. The sauce is the only thing that's not even like a raw food. But the way it's put together, the intent of what they choose, that's what makes it an amazing delicacy, potentially, or gives it that potential, let's say. In our world, it has a lot more to do with choosing the ingredients and the intent, what we're going to do with them, based on our business models, our investment, and then our investment return. What we want to see, what we can afford to pay at the beginning, what we want on the other end, and what pieces can we use to put that together and make it work. And in architecture, Corbusier talked about the Villa Savoye as a machine for living in. He had this real intent of houses as machines, buildings as machines, which, honestly led to some pretty brutal stuff. But the point is that there was this clear intent that was the filter for all of the decisions sort of downstream. And in our world, that intent can come from really anywhere. In my world, I don't care where it comes from as long as it exists. As long as intent exists, that's something we can base projects on. Whether or not the intent is right or it's a good idea, that's sort of a different conversation. But assuming that the intent is something that is worthwhile, images like this, just the idea of icebergs, like the relationship between these things, leads to projects like this. This is a Rafael Moneo project in Spain. These two sort of beautiful buildings, sort of canted away. They're sort of, I at least look at them as these icebergs. And when we were working on the project in DC that was Brooklyn Boulders Eckington, now Bouldering Project DC, when we were designing these walls, when we were designing the layout of the whole facility, we were thinking of these things as icebergs. And these things, these freestanding objects in a larger sort of ocean of pad, how do they relate to each other? How do you move around them? The sort of angular nature of them, the striking kind of features. And, in climbing, I look at a lot of other actual outdoor climbs. I don't understand when so many climbing walls are just these sort of blobby things that are so uninspiring. We travel the world to climb on things because they look cool and the rock is good. So why shouldn't our climbing gyms be the same? So this is a boulder problem. Bundesliga. We started doing roofs like this. This is a roof and salt pump that we designed that looks, to me, it looks steeper from this angle, but it actually is very similar in terms of the steepness. You can see it sort of on the left side there. It's a roof, but it's really intended to climb like that problem. Problems like Living Large, like a absolutely stunning arete in Rocklands. This is the kind of stuff we're looking at when we're looking at, climbing these corners, like finding a line that you walk up to and want to climb on. Or the Red Monster in Ibex, one of my personal favorite places in the whole world. This idea of a boulder, a slightly overhung boulder with world-class problems from left to right. And that's very much what we were looking at when we were designing this facility, a sort of red monster in the middle of the project. Or in this case, more for actual climbing wall design, another Rocklands image of, when I look at this, it's a flat face that is sort of carved by a curving face. And so that's what we did in this project in Chicago. This was a now closed gym in Chicago where the stripy bit is curved and the panel bit is flat. So again, giving this balance of super easy settable area with a sort of visual striking line. And the feedback was, not only did it look good, but it was very settable, very climbable. And that was the intent. So we have ingredients and intent. What is the relationship between things? These things on their own don't mean much. Whether it's an ecology, I look at these buildings as really almost an ecology of parts in so many ways. How do they feed off of each other? Or in this case, how do they literally feed on each other? Skateboarding, this stair set in Leon, 25 stairs is being looked at very differently by the skater than, say, the artists or someone who has in a wheelchair, for instance. Like this set of stairs, or someone just walking on them. They might just get tired walking up, let alone jump down them on a skateboard. It is a feature that the way you relate to it and its relationship to the user is wildly different in all of these cases. And even within, say, the world of skateboarding, I like this diagram of, that orange stair, which is what we were just looking at, versus how does it relate to other skate features that are very popular, El Toro, Davis, places like that. And this relational idea is talked about a lot in the world of architecture. I could go deep in sort of architecture theory, which we're not going to. I'll talk to you privately if you like about any of that. But the point is that the relationship of climbing specifically is a great example of how relations change at scale. So the idea that being a viewer of Devil's Tower compared to being a climber or sort of looking at a picture of the chimneys on Devil's Tower versus the actual grain and sort of way that you put your hands and toes on these little grains. So the scale has everything to do with relationship to you and has everything to do with your experience in that moment as the user. In architecture, we can talk about that. One of the most fundamental ways is the slope of floors, because generally speaking, buildings need to have flat floors, but that isn't always the case. And, there's whole sort of ideas of oblique surface circulation. How do you create flatness, flat surfaces on complicated geometries? A very real problem in climbing, which I don't think gets enough attention, that is, I'll be talking more about and I sort of have talked about in my climbing wall work, and how people actually move across these surfaces. In architecture, there's very specific rules about all of this, and it varies country to country. But the point is that you're sort of creating a situation for people to interact with, much like climbing gyms or skate parks or wherever. This is a Picasso sculpture in Chicago, and the base of it is this sort of giant steel plate. And depending on who you are, your relationship to it changes dramatically. Just looking at it versus climbing on it, running under it, skating on it. And so in our world, the relationship between things isn't something that's right or wrong, or for one way that is the only way. It's much more about creating situations that people can sort of work within and kind of nudging them in certain directions. And this idea of form, meaning the shape of things, out of formation, meaning it develops the final result, the look of something, developing out of the reasons and the sort of logic of how you got there. So it developing like this nautilus shell, sort of like growing on itself. So by the time you get to the end, you actually know why you got there and how you got there. And relationship wise, it makes a huge difference on how you do that. The flour type, the sugar type, the dough type. If you can't tell, I like cookies, which you'll see more of in a minute. Same thing with fitness. Peloton or SoulCycle is not the same as Orange Theory. And even within the same ingredients, the ratios, again, this is purely relationship, sugar, fat, flour, very different looks. The relationship of how you prepare a material, room temp butter, cold butter, melted butter. And bringing it back to our world, I look at a lot of facility layouts as sort of rivers almost, where people are moving through them. And so where can we collect people in these kind of eddies versus letting them kind of run through at a faster clip? And so, this is Somerville, now the Bouldering Project Boston. And, there's quite literally a river that kind of goes through it. And it's keeping people away from fall zones. It's allowing people to walk through the facility without going on pads. And it's entirely intentional. And there's these eddies, these sort of blue ovals that are around that. And there's this line from right to left, the long arrow, that is also going through the entire facility. And so, this idea of eddies, this idea of, you've got this vision, this line right through the whole thing, which I'll show in a minute. That path that we were talking about, it goes, from the entry through the facility. This is where that photo was taken. You can do these loops. And there's these eddies that you can sort of move off of that loop. It's not that this is a science experiment in terms of being overly specific, but it is trying to embed intent through organization. And so that line of sight that I drew out is this. You can see all the way end to end through the window, which is not an accident that the window is there. And it's not an accident that the viewing is really good from up here. And, it allows for a multitude of users to move through the space and have their own experiences, whether you're a professional or your first time there, or you're a parent. It's trying to create a framework through intent to allow people to kind of have that flexibility. So the intent is actually sort of intentionally non-specific within a certain idea of organization. Principle 6, the last one, we simply have to see obstacles as opportunities. It's a cliche. Hold on to your butts, as Samuel says. This is such a long process. There are so many people involved. If you're doing this right now, you're experiencing this already. You have to have a goal of why this matters to you enough to put the time in to go from the relatively fun part, well, really fun part of sort of dreaming about this stuff through so many other people involved as you sort of take that script that you develop and build the whole team to execute. As you work through numbers and budgeting, as you work through business modeling, as you, in this case, are raising a roof and getting rained and snowed on in the building. Not the first or the last time this happened in one of my projects. But the opportunity here, this sort of raised area, the reason we did that was because, the sort of height of most of the building that was existing was, say, about 30 feet, just kind of not enough. So the location of the project was such that if you could get it to 50 feet, which is what we did, it just really creates a distinct identity and a higher barrier to entry. So the decision was made that this is a good decision. Strategically, from a user point of view, it's better climbing, does all these different things. And so the game became, how do you locate a new mezzanine? How high do you raise the building? How do you coordinate all of this stuff? That sort of became the name of the game. But the challenge of the building not being exactly what we wanted actually was an opportunity, because guess what? No building existed that was exactly what we wanted. So we had to build it. That was the opportunity. And the result is a sort of unique facility within an area that you would be surprised where it is. It's in one of the most dense cities in the country. Other opportunities. This is an opportunity that actually went the wrong way. I was on site for this building. This was a project, will remain nameless, but effectively the landlord was doing this work, and the building itself was really falling down. And so the opportunity was offered to us to actually take over the project. And we said no, because I thought that it could be a money pit. And there's a reason why this never opened as a project, because it turned out to be a money pit. And, this is the view of the inside of, similarly to Somerville, this is Chicago, digging these huge pits, pouring foundations in the West Loop right across from downtown Chicago, so that you can put something like this in it, which is like a pretty remarkable space in a sort of unsuspecting area of town. And so all of those projects are really just examples of kind of not being good with good enough, and really just focusing on how can we make these things great and choosing which areas to put our money in. So finally, some of the don'ts. I put these as principles because if you do this stuff, you probably aren't going to make it to the end, or you might not be happy with what you end up with. So we will not be the test case. I've seen this too many times where an architect, I'll just say architects because I am one. I'll use myself as not myself, but my profession as a foil. They don't know what the heck they're doing, but they say they do. And, they're qualified enough to make buildings. Maybe they've even done something, but they might design something that blows your budget, doesn't meet your budget, isn't even close to your budget, isn't good enough. You cannot be the test case for them who thinks this is just a cool thing to be a part of, even if they aren't an actual expert or have the right vision for it. Same thing goes with contractors. Somebody who builds houses is probably not the person you want to be doing a roof raise in downtown Chicago. You can't be the test case. There's too much involved in this. There's too much on the line. When you're working on the architecture side, I feel like they don't always see that. When I work with owners, so much of this is fundraising and getting ready for talking with stakeholders that it's so obvious that you've got probably a lot of your money involved, other people, friends and family. You cannot have someone else be just like figuring it out on your dime. It's not necessary, so I wouldn't do it. So don't be the test case. Number 2, don't draw stuff without budgets. Who cares what it looks like if it doesn't actually, mean that you can do it? Everything's going to almost go more higher than your budget when you draw it. But drawing stuff without a budget at all, without any understanding, is really just wasting your time and money. And it can be a lot of money. I've had people say, oh yeah, I was told it'll be $50,000, $200,000 to do this schematic development set. Based on what? If there's not an understanding of what that means, how it relates to your real estate market, how it relates to, are you buying, are you leasing, are you remodeling, are you taking something existing? What's that investment number to get open, and then designing to that? Early days, it's concept. It's not going to be specific. But if we don't establish that ballpark, how can we possibly do anything that matters? This is not how you're trained as an architect. I went to Harvard. I went to one of the best architecture schools, and this conversation never happened. But in practice, to help people open buildings, I don't know how. I think it's a disservice to clients when it's not talked about. And guess what? It is not talked about, except by, I think, people like contractors or developers or folks like me who have done both of those things and realize I'm here to build stuff, not waste time. And that sort of parlays into number 3, which is don't blow budgets early. No matter if you feel like you've got enough money, you're not going to have enough money by the end. It just is that simple, especially in a world where costs have gone up 30 or 40% in the last 3 years. And that is way more than inflation. That's not just inflation. That's inflation plus. And so you have to be careful with our budgets early. How far can we get to the point where we can make decisions about signing LOIs, signing a lease? How can we do that efficiently? I'm not saying don't spend anything, because I don't think that's the proper due diligence. And most of my clients I work with are either advising pre-LOI or sort of LOI to lease and beyond. So the strategy in a lot of ways is for me to help them manage that budget. And the way I work with people is a reflection of that, I think, because the best solution in my mind is the same as for the client, which is opening amazing projects. Then guess what? We work on the next one together, which is what usually happens with clients. It's sort of like a long-term mindset, which is the same as how you manage your budget. Don't blow it early, or you might just run out of money. And then the last one, don't mistake simple for easy. Just because something looks simple, it actually probably is hard. Something that looks all kind of wonky, like that climbing wall I was showing with like stripes and just kind of like random shapes, that's easy. That's garbage. Anybody can do that. My 5-year-old can do that because it has no direction, it has no intent, it has no vision. Creating something that's clean with vision and impact might look simple, but it's not easy. And I think anybody who's gone through this knows that. So finally, good to great is about adding tenths, to create sort of seconds of improvement, meaningful improvement. There's probably some ground fruit you can pick up than the low-hanging fruit, but very rarely is it like a fundamental DNA change. It's about listening to the things we already know, whether we realize it or not, putting it together properly, and not being someone's test case. So you can reach out to me if you like. I'm happy to talk through questions and comments. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to get into anything. Otherwise, thank you very much for your attention. And what I will be doing is also following up in the coming months. I'm doing these monthly. I'll be talking about more of the process and the steps as well. But this is sort of the principles, because these filter through every single decision over a very long period of time. And that's why anchoring to them is so key. So thank you very much. Yeah, thanks, Jared. Appreciate that. Yeah, and by the way, if there's ever any, I see people logged in, a bunch of people who've, you know, I see a reasonable amount in these things. If anybody has ideas too, I'm always happy to. As I said, my YouTube content is almost entirely based on either things I've learned or things I'm learning and watching clients go through. So I'm always happy to sort of angle things or at least address concerns or comments. So, one thing that comes up a lot too, though, the way that we handle budgets, I'm not saying that it doesn't cost a little more to get really good projects. It probably costs a little more. It's just not all about that. And I'm not even convinced that's always true, because if you're spending money to build bathrooms or build climbing walls or whatever, within that budget you have, just doing that right, that's the name of the game. And like it can be done in a very great way. And so that's really what this is all about. So thanks everybody for being here. I really appreciate it. And I'll be posting a replay of this as well. But thank you very much. And reach out if I can help with anything. I'll talk to you soon.